Hi guys, in this video we're going to talk about the anti-terror measures being taken in France and Macron's descent into authoritarianism. Last time we talked about the Je Suis Samuel attacks in France and the need to protect free speech. But we also talked about how President Macron should not fall into the trap of using terrorism to justify authoritarian measures. Unfortunately, Macron has fallen into that trap. While he initially presented himself as a forward-thinking liberal leader, Macron's proposed law to fight what he calls Islamic separatism, as well as a security law to prevent the filming of police brutality, which was only scrapped after mass protests, have revealed the increasingly authoritarian nature of his presidency. Do these measures go too far, and how effective are they really at fighting extremism? Let's discuss in this video. 52% of you are not subscribed, so be sure to subscribe for more political analysis and hit that bell notification while you're at it. I also have a special announcement at the end of this video, so watch till the end. See no evil. As most of you know, France was struck by multiple terrorist attacks in October, including the assassination of schoolteacher Samuel Paty for showing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. In response, Macron has promised to crack down on extremism, and the first law he unveiled was the so-called security law. Created in response to acts of violence against police officers, this law, amongst others, makes it illegal for anyone to share images of the police that could lead to a police officer being identified or harmed in any way. The punishment is up to 1 year in jail or a €45,000 fine. Now, the law was eventually scrapped, and it's clear why. With a very vague definition of what harm is, the law effectively bans filming of police, which would make it illegal to film police committing acts of police brutality. And this has been a big issue in France. From the Yellow Vest protests to the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, protests in France have been marred by police brutality. By preventing people from capturing these incidents on camera, the police are allowed to operate totally unaccountable. But this is not surprising, as the French police were critical to crushing the protests against Macron's reforms. They helped him, and now he helps them. This step towards authoritarianism was met by mass protests, which themselves featured multiple incidents of police brutality. What ultimately caused Macron to step back was when video emerged of French police beating a black musician to a pulp inside his own music studio. This occurred because he was standing outside his studio not wearing a mask, and when he went inside, the police entered without a warrant and beat him senseless. The police claimed that he had provoked them and tried to steal their weapons, and without the camera footage, the police version of events would have gone unquestioned. It is precisely these sorts of incidents that Macron is trying to sweep under the rug. His thinking is, if you see no evil, there is no evil. A country where the police cannot be held accountable is not a democracy, it is an authoritarian nightmare. The law against Islamic separatism. But the security law was not Macron's only attempt to fight extremism. Soon after the attacks, Macron announced the need to fight what he called Islamic separatism. The idea that a parallel society is being created in France that does not respect France's secular republican values. And so to fight Islamic separatism, Macron has proposed what he called the law to bolster the respect of the principles of the Republic. But will the law actually achieve this? The law gives the government the power to inspect and shut down places of worship and community organizations that receive public funding if they don't respect French Republican values. It also requires them to sign a commitment to upholding French Republican values in order to receive public funding. It requires parents to seek government authorization to apply for homeschooling. Any foreign funding of religious institutions over €10,000 must be declared. It introduces criminal charges for people who threaten public servants in order to get religious exceptions and those who expose the personal information of any public servant online. It also introduces restrictions on virginity tests, forced marriage, and polygamy. And finally, it extends the principle of neutrality that exists in the public service. You see, before this, only public servants were not allowed to wear any religious symbols to ensure that the government is separate from any religion. But now this requirement will also be extended to private contractors who do work for the government. Now, some of those provisions make sense. Protecting public servants from being threatened or having their private information exposed makes sense. After all, Samuel Paty had his private information put online and was assassinated shortly after. The restrictions on foreign funding also make sense, as much of the Islamic extremism around the world has much more to do with Saudi Arabia funding radicalism than anything else. Also, requiring organizations that receive taxpayer money to sign on to French Republican values makes sense. And restricting virginity tests, forced marriage, and polygamy is a no-brainer. This is just exploitation of women. But that is where the praise stops. Macron's government has already demonstrated that it will abuse the powers given to it by this law. Macron's hardline interior minister, Gérald Darmanin, has already used the power to ban organizations, not just against possibly extremist organizations, but also against community organizations like the Collective Against Islamophobia, which was banned. Using these new powers to shut down community organizations fighting Islamophobia isn't exactly counter-terrorism, it's just being punitive against Muslims. But this is not surprising given that this same minister stated that he was shocked to find separate halal and kosher food in the supermarkets. Despite claims that the law is not meant to target Muslims, indeed the law does not contain the word Islam or Islamism, the intended target is clear. Macron's government is conflating religious expression with religious extremism. Someone eating halal or wearing a religious symbol is not extremism. But this confusion is reflected in Macron's proposal to ban private contractors from being allowed to wear any religious symbols. What on earth does, for example, preventing a caterer for a French government event from wearing a hijab have to do with fighting Islamic extremism? But this is emblematic of the heavy-handed approach not just of Macron himself, but of the French system of laïcité in general. And the thing is that this heavy-handed approach to religion doesn't work, and you'll see why in a sec. Freedom from religion. France's system of laïcité is very different from the kind of secularism that you have in the Netherlands, Great Britain, or America. In those countries, secularism just means separation of church and state and freedom of religion. You are free to practice, as long as you don't violate the law or try to take over the government. But France goes one step further. They have freedom from religion. It is not just the government's job to ensure that all citizens are free to pray as they like, but to ensure that the public space is entirely free of anything to do with religion. Now, the original 1905 law, which established secularism, was only intended to apply to public servants to ensure religious neutrality in the government, because at the time the Catholic Church had immense power over society. But in response to the increase of the Muslim population in France and the increasing prevalence of hijabs in schools, this type of secularism has been extended far beyond this. In 2004, France implemented a ban on ostentatious religious wear in schools, such as Christian crosses, Jewish yarmulkes, and Muslim hijabs. And while this law was neutral on paper, in practice, it was clear that the intent was to ban hijabs in schools. After all, it was a national debate on Muslim hijabs that prompted the law, and Muslims were most likely to be affected by it. Now, at the time, the law was justified by this same idea that Macron has of protecting French secularism, as well as protecting Muslim girls who might be facing social pressure to wear the hijab. But did the law actually have a positive effect? A large-scale study comparing Muslim and non-Muslim girls before and after the law found that the law decreased the chances of Muslim girls finishing school, reduced their chances of getting a job, and increased discrimination against them as the law stigmatized Muslims. On top of that, rather than increasing Muslim integration, the law decreased it because suddenly for these girls, their Muslim identity was framed as incompatible with their French identity. And so the study showed that these girls were more likely to identify with the land of their parents than with France after the ban. This law has been followed by other laws that again were neutral on paper, but were clearly intended to restrict Muslim religious wear in public, like the famous burkini ban, where Muslim women were forced by the police to strip down at the beach for wearing religious garb in public. Macron's law to ban religious wear for private contractors is just the latest iteration of this. And while it's true that on a number of key issues, French Muslims are less likely to believe in French Republican values, the point is that if your aim is to fight the development of parallel societies and counter radicalization by integrating Muslims, then this is not the way to do it. Targeting people on the basis of their identity is not going to make them integrate. It's going to make them retreat into their religious community and make them more susceptible to radicalization. Perhaps it's not surprising that French Muslims are less likely to support French republicanism when that republicanism is often used against them. The key to integration is having people believe that they will benefit by buying into these values, not that they will be targeted using these values. This again shows that a heavy-handed approach often does not work and has the opposite effect. The government telling people what they can and cannot wear is authoritarian. But none of this is surprising when you consider that Macron has a history of exercising power in a monarchical style. From liberal to authoritarian. When Macron came to power, he was touted as one of the few leaders willing to stand up for European values and tackle authoritarian regimes in Turkey and Hungary head on. But very quickly it became clear that Macron was someone not used to not getting his way. Until recently, Macron's party, En Marche, which is a new party, held an absolute majority in parliament. Macron made sure to handpick each of the new parliamentarians and chose mostly political newcomers to diminish the chance that they would form any kind of significant check on him. Contrast this with previous presidents who have at times been opposed by members of their own party when they went too far, forming a check against their own power. But this wasn't enough for Macron, and so he proposed a law that doesn't just allow the president to veto laws passed by parliament, which is currently the case, but also allows the president to veto proposals or amendments before they've even been passed, increasing the control of the president over the parliament. Through this measure, the president gains the power of the law-making process, which is parliament's job, not the president's. And so through this measure, the separation of powers, which is critical to a democracy, is violated. On top of that, Macron has not been afraid to rule by decree when he couldn't get his way. He tried to reform the public sector without parliamentary approval and in the face of mass protests. And he used a presidential decree to force through a pension reform, bypassing parliament, which led to massive protests in 2020. Now, on this channel, I have criticized the authoritarian tendencies of right-wing populists like Bolsonaro in Brazil, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and Duterte in the Philippines. But when authoritarian tendencies come from a mainstream liberal leader, I have to criticize that as well. The main reason Macron won was because he was the only alternative to stop populist right-wing candidate Marine Le Pen from winning. Yet he himself has demonstrated a clear tendency towards concentration of power. The Political Opportunist. But the motivation for Macron's authoritarian turn is clear. Macron lost his majority when a number of left-wing MPs ditched his own party. On top of that, his approval rating remains low at 39%. Not too bad by French standards, but hardly anything to write home about. But the key factor is Marine Le Pen. Elections are just 17 months away, and the polls show him neck and neck with the populist right-wing candidate Marine Le Pen. So Macron's tough policies on Islam and security are clearly motivated by the need to win over right-wing voters. But it goes deeper than that. Crime has become a hot-button issue, despite the fact that crime has gone down since the mid-1980s. This is because of the tough law and order rhetoric of Marine Le Pen, who uses terms like ensavagement to describe the crime situation in France. She has forced other politicians to adopt similar rhetoric, despite the fact that crime is not getting worse. This is because crime is a proxy for other issues, mainly France's insecurity about its national identity in the face of Muslim immigration. Thus, the rising crime is mostly framed as an immigration and a cultural issue, and the result is that even so-called moderate leaders like Macron are forced to adopt harsh measures even when these clearly don't work. Macron's effort to compete with the reactionary politics of Marine Le Pen is only driving him to adopt the same reactionary policies which he claims to be stopping. But whether his motivations are political or ideological, the outcome is the same. France already has an extensive anti-terrorism and security apparatus, but with every new attack and every new president, new, more expansive powers of mass surveillance and government intrusion into people's lives are created. Under previous presidents and now under Macron, France is sleepwalking into a society where every aspect of religious life is regulated, where the government can spy on people and shut down organizations at will. Not only will this defeat the cause of freedom he claims to stand for, it will not improve Muslim integration, rather it will increase Muslim alienation. And that's dangerous. Special announcement. With the end of the year in sight, it is time we did another Q&A, so feel free to ask me questions about politics, the channel, or myself. You can leave your questions in the comments below, and I will try to include as many of them as possible in the Q&A video. Questions from Patreons do get first priority, so for a 100% chance of your question being included, become a member on Patreon. Check out my last video on the Je Suis Samuel attacks in France and the battle between free speech and religion. Thank you to my Patreons for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.